Dr. Giovanni Bennett, Dr. Erica Lawrence, and Tia Deacon, who is one of our museum educators. So with that, I will introduce Julie Leitner, who is our leader of exhibition development and education. Thanks, Julie.
Yes, thank you guys so much for being here tonight. We're starting to be open late on Thursdays till 8 o'clock now. And we plan to have more opportunities for conversation like this going forward. So thanks so much for coming out, especially on Harvest Homecoming booth night. Maybe afterwards you can go enjoy some funnel cake and things like that. We are here against the backdrop of an exhibition called Hoosier Lifelines, Environmental and Social Change Along the Monon Railway. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look, this is part of the Louisville Photo Biennial. Every other October, galleries and museums all around the Louisville area show photography, and so we are part of that, and this is a group show of photographers who are exploring the traces of a no longer running, no longer operating railway called the Monon. So it's a very literal railroad to provide kind of a counterpoint to the somewhat figurative one that we'll be talking about today. Our guest speaker is a historian who was educated outside of the sphere of the academic institution. His formal education is in business management, but through his passionate pursuit of stories that dig deep into humanity, he's created a history podcast called The Humanity Archive. And to use his own words, this podcast exists to tell the story of the historically unheard, to tell the stories that you didn't learn in school, end quote. He's currently in the process of releasing a 12-part series in the podcast around the history of slavery and resistance, particularly American slavery, I believe. He's also currently writing a book on Black history under Row House Publishing and Simon & Schuster, which will be out in 2023. Very excited. So you can find his podcast on iTunes, Apple products. Go on and download his podcast, leave a review. In one of his podcast episodes about the history of global slavery, Jermaine Fowler says this as he lays out his intentions. We are going to tell this untellable story because the story must be told. Always seeking to answer the fundamental question, why? So we hope to expand on that conversation this evening. And after Jermaine's presentation, he'll take a few questions, and then we'll welcome museum educator Tia Deacon, as well as Dr. Erica Lawrence and Dr. Giovanni Bennett to engage in a further discussion of all of you around this subject. So thanks for being here, and let me welcome Jermaine Fowler.
All right, well, just want to start off by saying it is a joy to be here at the Carnegie Center. I've been here several times before, and I'm really in awe of how you all bring art to community and community to this artwork here. I met Julie, so I just want to really give a shout out to Julie right now because she's doing all that. She had right here today. I met Hannah before, and Shamia was here as well, and I just really love how they have vision and the courage to try to transform these stories and bring more nuance to these stories, bring more truth to these stories, because in all honesty, I don't think they've been told correctly for quite a long time. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here too. You could have been anywhere else, but you chose to come here today. Could have been at the festival or anywhere, but I hope to, again, have a nuanced conversation. Now, I'll start by saying whenever I was a kid, like a lot of kids, I too thought that the Underground Railroad was a subterranean train underground, and it was taking people from south to north to freedom. But it was whenever I read the words of Frederick Douglass, probably the most influential abolitionist of the 19th century, and what does Douglass tell us? He says, I prayed and prayed for 20 years for freedom, but I received no answer until I prayed with my legs. To me, that was the embodiment of the Underground Railroad. It wasn't some imaginary train system. Only through self-determination, organization, and coalition building did an estimated 100,000 black people escape to a fragile freedom. That's 100,000 examples of agency, 100,000 examples of self-preservation, and 100,000 examples of people unwilling to deal with the unwanted misery, escaping the African Holocaust that brought over 12.5 million, some say 30 million, some say 60 million people on that terrible journey known as the Middle Passage. I always like to remember those who didn't make it too, because they say that at least 50,000 people per year tried to escape, didn't make it. Now, I know that the Underground Railroad has been one of the most popular histories. You've got TV shows, you've got Colson Whitehead's novel, Underground Railroad, movies like Harriet's. There was a critically acclaimed show that came out recently called Underground. The stories of those who fled slavery have been some of the most popular in our history. But the stories of the Underground Railroad have been oversimplified and mythologized. So today I would hope to bring a nuanced history and not only talk about people who were running, but what they were running from. Now, there's a lot of myths about the Underground Railroad. A lot of people think there were fixed routes and agents and passwords and people going down into hidey holes. It wasn't really like that. Sometimes people concealed themselves, but it was in haylofts and it was in spare bedrooms. They had hiding swamps and even in caves. So this isn't some glamorous James Bond type of escape we're talking about here. Another myth is that the Underground Railroad existed because of the humanitarian, compassionate-hearted, good-willed white people helping downtrodden black people. That Underground Railroad didn't exist either. As a matter of fact, until the 60s, histories rarely referenced the efforts of black people on the Underground Railroad. You had those like Levi Coffin, a white abolitionist Quaker who styled himself as, quote, the president of the Underground Railroad. And he said this about black involvement. He said, there were a few careful managers, but only a few. The majority could not be trusted. They lacked shrewdness and caution and could sometimes be bribed to act as spies or betray the hiding places of fugitives. So we have to be honest about this history of white liberals talking down condescendingly to black people, trying to put them in a position of sons, daughters. I don't want to discount the legacies of white allies on the railroad. You had those like John Brown, willing to die for black freedom. You had those like William Lloyd Garrison, the Grimke sisters. I won't discount their legacy, but the problem is black people have been placed on the margins of these stories, where they should be at the center of the story. It was mostly black people helping each other on the Underground Railroad. So today I'm going to focus less on the white saviors and more on the black agency. Now, what was the Underground Railroad? There were networks and organizations and vigilance committees, anti-slavery societies, but it was mostly individuals and community groups. They're interacting sometimes, but there's no one group who's coordinating all this. And I'm going to tell you some stories today. I'm going to talk about some of the fugitives from slavery. I'm going to talk about some of the people who helped out on the Underground Railroad. But I want you to remember that this history isn't for heroification and over-admiration, but historians call monumentalism, where we put people up on a pedestal. We have to remember that these were living, breathing people just like you and me, who have the courage to challenge injustice and also make a dash for freedom. Some of the towering figures, of course, were those like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, belovedly called Black Moses, but I want to look at some other figures today. You had those like Elizabeth Freeman and Sarah Parker Revin. You had Ellen Craft and William Craft. They say those who fight injustice together stay together longer. They don't really say that, but it's a beautiful thing to look back in the history, though, and see a husband and wife together who are willing to fight injustice together. You had those like William Steele, who could be, if he so prescribed himself, which he didn't, he was a little more humble, but he helped 649 fugitives to freedom. Black man. But just remember, though, these are waves in a bigger ocean. There's so many other unnamed, unknown people who were behind the scenes who will never know who were the real embodiment of the Underground Railroad. When I was writing this, I was thinking about just all the various ways, like how did they do it? All those people who made their way to Philadelphia, New York, and places like right here in the New Albany, Indiana area. They walked. They rode, hit on steamboats, mailed themselves like Henry Box Brown, hid in wagons, they swam, they hit on trains that disguised themselves. And if they were able to weave themselves around the fact that black people were not allowed to learn how to read, they forged on free papers. I think about the abolitionists too, like what were their motivations? Why become an outlaw? Why risk your fragile freedom to help others? Well, a lot of times it was a deep spirituality, an ethical and moral responsibility. Others believed in this idea of equality in the face of American hypocrisy, and it challenged us to think about what sacrifices we are willing to make for freedom and justice. Now, before I really get into some of these stories, I just want to start this off on a note of reverence and love. Because I might say something that might unsettle you, it might unnerve you, and it might unhouse you. And we live in an era, too, where Hollywood profits so much off of black pain. People use the tragedy of black experiences to make $1, shock people. I always like to tell the story about Harriet Tubman in reference to this and how she declined an invitation to go see Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. A lot of y'all probably read that in school. It was flying off the shelves, right? People wanted to see what slavery was like in novel form. So what do? Whenever a book sells off the shelves, they turn it into a movie. Back then, they turned it into theater. So they invited Harriet Tubman. She was Harriet Tubman. Hey, come see this play in Philadelphia. What did Harriet Tubman tell us? She said, I ain't got no heart to see the sufferings of my people played out on a stage. I have seen the real thing, and I don't want to see it on no stage or in no theater. So when I tell the stories and recount everything that I'm going to tell you is not for shock value, we're not going to reduce the Underground Railroad to the status of a wall outlet. I tell these stories in the spirit of reverence, coming from the Greek word reverie. What does that mean? It means to stand in awe of, to stand in respect of, to be afraid of. So whenever I walk through the corridors of the Carnegie Center, those pictures jump off the wall at me, and I stand in awe of the courage, sacrifice of those who help themselves and help others on the way to freedom on the Underground Road. I think we have to unsilence history too. It was the German poet Gerta who said, he or she who has never despaired has never lived. So I get so passionate about this because I connect to the pain. I have not fallen victim to the spiritual calcification where people could look at these stories and turn their head in apathy. Can't hide the truth. The truth deals on equal terms with hope and despair. It was Maya Angelou who said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So yes, there was fear on the Underground Railroad. There was anxiety on the Underground Railroad. There was loss on the Underground Railroad. People separated from their families on the Underground Railroad. Abject poverty and slavery on the Underground Railroad. We cannot deny that fact. But there was also hope on the Underground Railroad. Those who took a risk for freedom on the Underground Railroad carved out lives in the face of that slavery on the Underground Railroad, who lived and laughed and loved on the Underground Railroad. The earliest mention that I found on the Underground Railroad was in 1831, when a man named Tice Davis escaped from Kentucky to Ohio. And the enslaver blamed, you guessed it, the Underground Railroad, right? Tice swam across the Ohio River. Now, I grew up close enough to the Ohio River where we'd ride our bikes there, we'd like skip rocks off the banks of the Ohio River. I remember these myths, they said they were like catfish the size of Volkswagens in the Ohio River. There's no way I was going to swim in there, go in there, anything like that. So I think about that when I think about those who are willing to get swept under the current of the Ohio River rather than get swept back under the current of red slavery. I got a couple of passages by a historian that I deeply respect. His name was John Hope Franklin. He wrote the book Runaway Slaves, Rebels on the Plantation. And he's a towering figure to me because he's one of those first generations of historians in the 1960s who was willing to put the focus on all those lost stories on the Underground Railroad when we had such history where it had been whitewashed. So he talks about an enslaved man simply known as Jake. It's one of the most important figures to me in Franklin's text. It's a story about what it means to resist, to be unhappy, to be discontent, to be outraged, and to push back against the status of being a slave. And Jake was willing to die and kill to be free. This is in contrast to the stories of the docile, meek, timid stereotype of enslaved people that we've heard so much. What does Franklin say in his text? Page 1, chapter 1. It says, on August 17, 1840, the day of a great Whig convention in Nashville, Tennessee, Jake, a slave owned by an old and respected farmer, Robert Bradford, refused to go to work. Like other blacks in the neighborhood, he wanted to go to the convention, listen to the speeches, and attend the celebrations. The overseer informed Bradford that Jake was in an ugly mood and asked him what to do. Bradford said that he would speak with Jake and see if he could calm him down. Bradford was unable to placate the black man, ordered the overseer to tie him up for a whipping. Jake quickly drew a knife. Whether he aimed to cut the rope or the overseer, no one knew. But he made a wild thrust which killed Mr. Bradford on the spot. Jake absconded to the woods. 9 days later, a notice appeared in the Nashville Whig. A 30-year-old slave named Jake, a raw-boned, quick-spoken man of bright complexion weighing 160 to 170 pounds, had murdered old man Bradford. A short time later, Governor James K. Polk offered a reward for his apprehension. Despite concerted efforts by constables, justices of the peace, and local citizens, Jake remained at large for a number of months. Finally, however, he was captured, tried, and hanged. Few lamented his passing, but the death of the esteemed Bradford was universally mourned by the whites in the community. Murders such as the one on the Bradford farm in 1840 were rare under the slave regime, but the incident revealed undercurrents that were quite common. Like Jake, other slaves were frustrated, alienated, defiant, sometimes violent. Indeed, Jake's anger, hostility, represented a far greater proportion of the enslaved population than might be suspected. For me, the story allows me to stay in tune with those whose humanity has been overlooked. I educate myself on these stories so I can find more love, more courage, more compassion, more respect for human life. The risk that Jake was willing to take for freedom and knowing more for Jake. Now, as an exercise when you leave, I encourage you to research your own city or town's relationship to slavery, dig deeper. I'm from Louisville, and though Kentucky's short growing season didn't produce a massive need for enslaved labor, field labor, that didn't stop the slave economy. Situated on the Ohio River, Kentucky was a major route to transport enslaved people downriver. It was a huge slave market in Louisville. They got Marcus Court. A lot of people don't look at that history in the eye, but it was there. A lot of people like to think that Louisville was kind of, on the border, didn't have much to do with slavery, but that's not true. Louisville exported between 2,500 and 4,000 enslaved people per year to the Deep South. I'll talk about somebody briefly who can intersect this history between the Underground Railroad, Kentucky, Indiana. His name was Henry Viva. Born in 1815 to Mildred Jackson. And his father was also an enslaver. James Viva. He detailed his life in his autobiography, and Viv reminds me of the Samuel Beckett quote where he says, "Ever tried, ever failed, try again, fail better." Because Viv, he tried to escape, he failed, he tried again, he failed, tried again, until finally he made it to freedom. Of his early life, he writes, "I was educated in the school of adversity, whips and chains, compelled to work under the lash without wages, and often without clothes to hide my nakedness. I have often worked without enough to eat by day and night, laid my weary limbs down on the dirt floor, frequently walking in the month of December without shoes on my feet, cold on the frosty ground, cracked open and bleeding as I walked." He escaped to Louisville. Louisville held no refuge for Viv. What does he say about Louisville? He said it was like walking through a wilderness of vipers and snakes blindfolded. This is what he says about Louisville at that time. He's hiding under piles of wood in the daytime. At one point he said he's so close to his would-be captors he can reach out and touch them. He can breathe on them. He's finally caught, forced to work. He describes slavery like hell. Not the only one who describes slavery like hell. Harriet Tubman also describes slavery like hell. You think too, these people were part of a deep religious tradition, a lot of spirituality. So you can imagine that they had a spiritual or biblical understanding of hell, right? What does the Bible say about hell? Furnace of fire, wailing, gnashing of teeth, tormenting, fire, brimstone. They're saying slavery was worse than that. Viv goes on to say prisoners were made to saw or break stones while dragging massive logs chained to their feet. Talks about his wife was with him. We know that slavery was often much worse for women. 80% of the people who got away from slavery were men. Women had children with them. It wasn't as easy for them to escape. We don't like to talk about the exploitation, misogyny, sexism of women even today connected to this history. A lot of people like to hide the truth, but it was philosopher Theodore Adorno who said, "The need to let suffering speak is a condition of all truth." So we must let history speak. We must let the suffering of history speak. When the suffering of history does not speak, we get school textbooks that say enslaved people were workers and immigrants from Africa. There's textbooks right now that say that in them. People want to sanitize, deodorize, whitewash the history. Viv is sold again to Matthew Garrison, one of the most notorious and brutal slave traders in Louisville. And this is not just a black history, this is white history too, because white people were involved in this history. They want to call it black history, but we have those like Matthew Garrison. He was a white man, so we have to remember This is everybody's history. This is American history. So when I think about what's buying and selling too, I think about the economic impact of slavery. I was in the mall the other day, I passed by Brooks Brothers, sell button-up clothes, men's clothes, and Brooks Brothers used to sell slave clothes. CSX rail lines, you might drive over some railroad tracks on the way out here. Slaves were the ones who built a lot of the rail lines. Wall Street, speculation in enslaved people, auction blocks of enslaved people. New York Life Insurance Company sold policies on enslaved people. These companies are still in existence, so the economic foundations of these companies started with what? Started with slavery. Now, after finding out that his wife was sold to the Deep South, Viv ends up escaping by himself. It makes me think about the separation of families. I want to go back to Hope Franklin's text on page 50, chapter 1. He says, most slaves separated by sale or transfer can neither abscond in family units nor form colonies. Usually, I'm going to stop there because there were some colonies, people who, I don't know if you've heard of the Dismal Swamp, people they literally formed colonies, formed lives in swamplands to stay escape from slavery. I think that history is something that we need to dive into more as well. But he said, usually they were sold off and never saw members of their families again. The trauma of being separated forever from kith and kin can hardly be imagined. Most slaves were sold at one time or another during their lifetime, and often it was when they were young and would bring the highest price. Seldom were they sold together in family units. The mother, father, and children, separation of family members was common. 1 out of every 3 slave children under 15 years of age is probably separated from one or both parents, he says, and at its extreme, speculation involved black children. Story about a woman in Scott County, Kentucky, traded horses for 2 babies. We talk about the commodification of human beings is so parasitic that not even children can escape it. Reminded of the words of Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, the danger of the profit motive as the sole basis for an economic system is something we have to watch out for. We live in a situation now where 1% of the population owns 38.5% of the wealth. In our current system, your Tesla battery, your Apple phone battery, mined by children of the Congo. Starbucks presents itself as this ethical and moral responsible company. They found enslaved people in Brazil picking the coffee beans. Where is the accountability? People say you can criticize any system, right? Marxism. You should critique all isms, right? Because ism's ideology, you can get dogmatic about it. But if you criticize capitalism, it's un-American, right? But the problem with capitalism is people want the steak, they don't want the slaughter. All this ties back connections, capitalistic, opportunistic connection to slavery. There seems to always have to be some slave class, some people laboring under the foot of a ruling class in capitalism. So it should be critiqued just like any other system or ism should be critiqued. I'm not here to pontificate or be self-righteous. We're all complicit in our own ways. But I think that we have to have serious dialogues like this, because with honest dialogue, then hopefully we can bring the humanity forward and hope to transform society. If you only tell half the truth, we'll never be made whole. Now, there's a lot of Underground Railroad stories still coming to light. This history literally was hidden. A student at Columbia University was digging through some boxes. This is within the last 5 years to a decade. And they found this journalist from New York, his name was Sidney Howard Gay. He had taken down the stories of people as they were going north to freedom, and what seemed to be fairly accurately took their stories down as they told him. He had a black man with him. His name was Louis Napoleon, and Napoleon was the first point of contact with these people. And he would also help physically escort them further north once their stories were taken and once they saw what these people needed. I'm going to read a couple of these stories to you, because I think within these stories, what the people said, this is where the real Underground Railroad is, right here in these stories. The full moon traveled by night. Littleton Sewell, alias Johnson, belonged to N.M. Martin of Richmond, Virginia, left on the first, concealed on board a steamboat by a steward to whom he paid $60 all he had been threatened with punishment by his master for being out a half hour beyond time permitted by his pass. He said, I conclude to go where I don't need a pass to be out. 30 minutes. People always think, I think that there's these, only the people who were treated the most brutally wanted to escape from slavery. People just wanted to be free. They didn't have to have the most brutal treatment. Hope Franklin on page 116, he talks about the difficulty making it, because I think there's another bit that the North was this grand promised land that you could go to and just automatically be free. That wasn't the case. He says the dream of freedom in the North, the so-called promised land, went unfulfilled for the vast majority of runaways. Those who headed northward from plantations along the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, the Black Belt of Mississippi, and Alabama, they faced a track of hundreds of miles. They went through uncharted and largely unknown territory. Even their counterparts in the upper states confronted numerous obstacles to make it to free territory. A few were able to find assistance on the Underground Railroad, and a few others traveling by night or hiding on board sailing vessels and steamboats made it to the North, but the chances of making it were slim and remote. So you get most of the enslaved people coming from Maryland and Virginia, sometimes North Carolina, but a lot of people in the South, they didn't know about the Underground Railroad. They couldn't conceive of an Underground Railroad. A lot of them would try to make it to the free black communities in places like Atlanta, Savannah, Georgia. They were a little more insulated, could hide out there. They were trying to make it to the North. Now, abolition. 1830s, abolition really picks up as this radical organized movement. And there weren't very many abolitionists. Those who were daily, day in and day out, wake up out of bed thinking, eating, breathing abolition, we know that there were only like a few hundred. They were radicals, they were not popular. The Temperance Movement, believe it or not, was more popular than the abolitionist movement. People trying to get people to abstain from drinking alcohol. I can't imagine having a temperance movement today. Probably running out of town. We got gastro pubs and liquor stores on every corner. Nobody's really trying to give up alcohol today. But abolitionists, they're touching the chords of Northern consciousness, chords that will lead to the Civil War. We have to be honest, most people did nothing. Slavery itself was against the law in the North, but upholding the institution of slavery was the unspoken law in the North. The penalties for white abolitionists could be severe mob assaults, it's old school punishment, tarring and fetterings, and destruction of their careers, and lengthy prison sentences, occasional killings. Most people aren't going to risk that. See a protest, you think, I got a job, I got kids, I don't know if I can go to that, I don't know if I can risk it. But black abolitionists had it much worse, certain death, or they could be sold into slavery. A lot of people were adjusted to injustice. How many people today are so familiar with poverty, familiar with racism, murder, homophobia, wars, militarism, sexism, that when we see it, we don't even bat an eyelash. People won't lift the voice, people say nothing about it. I was reading about what's called the bystander effect, and a lot of times people have horrendous things happening to them, and people walk right by, adjusted to injustice. See a homeless person walk to the other side of the street, won't even acknowledge him. So the question is always, how do we cultivate a sensitivity to the vulnerable, those who need our help in our schools, at work, in our cities, in our towns. That's what abolitionism speaks to me. From a genuine place, too. Back during abolition, we have to be honest about the history as well, that a lot of white people wanted black freedom, but they wanted it with stipulations. On the eve of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln invited a group of black people, black leaders to the White House. He said, wow, I don't know if the masses of white people are ever going to be able to treat black people equally. Y'all should just go and head back to Africa. We got a country over there for you. It's called Liberia. We colonized it just for you. Stipulations. So we see the challenge right there of the idea and the execution of a multiracial democracy, how difficult that was. And honest Abe, right? Our 16th president, flawed leader. He embraced racism, even though he deplored slavery. And that question of race coming up, we know that Abraham Lincoln shot John Wilkes Booth for his decision to end slavery. This racial question always coming up. Deep, deep. I think that meeting that he had with those leaders too about go back to Africa, that goes today. Our immigration policies. Who gets to be an American? Toni Morrison, I wonder if she was right when she said American means white and everybody else has the idea. We have this xenophobic sensibility. Heard several times, I'll get online, I'll engage in a conversation. If you say something that somebody doesn't like about America, they'll tell you to go back to Africa. Still today, that sensibility still exists today. That the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 it compelled free states to return, escape fugitives to the South. But a lot of people don't talk about the Southern Underground Railroad. In Mexico, you could be free. 34 years before Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Afro-Mexican President Vicente Guerrero abolished slavery in the country. They said, if you come to Mexico, you're free once you touch down on Mexican soil. There was a man named Felix Haywood during the Federal Writers Project, this beautiful project where they sent out writers of the time to interview everybody from like folk singers to formerly enslaved people. This is the last generation of enslaved people, so those stories got written down because of this Federal Writers Project. They really need to do another one. But Felix Haywood was interviewed, and he said, sometimes someone would come along and try to get us to run up north and be free. There was no reason to run up north. All we had to do was cross the Rio Grande. We'd be free as soon as we crossed over. Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and later laws like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 further pressured citizens to take sides regarding the institution of slavery, striking chords again that would lead to the Civil War. All during this time, you had slave catchers prowling the streets, open. Cities like New York, Manhattan, openly carrying whips, pistols, manacles, trying to reclaim what they deemed as property. They entered black churches during Sabbath services to look for runaways. They broke into black people's homes without legal proceedings. Epidemic of kidnapping free black people. But I think that we a lot of times put a lot of the onus on the slave catcher and don't remember that he was part of a terrible and horrible system that still perpetuates itself. Racial oppression cutting across health and wealth, attitudes. We know that there was a judicial system, slave patrol, set up around the criminalization, containment, capture, control of black people. And we have a modern police force that is set up around decriminalization, containment, capture, and control, and disproportionate imprisonment of black people. The connection is there if you look for it. Got a couple more stories. They're important to this. One is of Ona Judge. There was a passage that was found and it said, Someone absconded from the household of the President of the United States. That president was George Washington. She lived as a house servant. As soon as she could, she ran away. As soon as she got a glimpse of freedom. And I think this story is important because the woman who wrote the book on Owner Judge, Erica Armstrong Dunbar, she said her publisher tried to get her to change the name of the book. The book was called Never Caught. She said the publisher tried to get her to change the name to something with the word freedom in it. She said, no, I'm not changing the name because Black people on this so-called Underground Railroad were never free. They were always fugitives. That's important to think about as well. Canada was probably the closest you could get to absolute freedom. You had towering figures like Josiah Henson, who escaped from Maryland to Ontario. He's connected to Harriet Tubman, so very true, powerful story. That book I told you about, Uncle Tom's Cabin, based on his life. He said, Canada was often spoken of as the only sure refuge from pursuit. And that blessed land was the desire of my longing heart. Infinite toils and perils lay between me and that haven of promise, enough to daunt the stoutest heart. But the fire behind me was too hot and fierce to let me pause and consider them. Henson, he's got his wife with him, he's got his 2 kids with him, one of his kids is carrying on his back. They almost starved, run out of provisions. Some Good Samaritans help him. What does Henson do? Does he go get comfortable with his freedom? No. Looks back, joins in on that same Underground Railroad that helped him get free. I want to round this out with a few more words in a poem by Robert Hayden. We're in this artistic place, so I thought a poem would be fitting. Hayden was a poet who wrote mostly in the 1960s. And it's called One Again, One Again. It's longer than what I'm going to read you, but I got a snippet. He says, run, falls, rising, stumbling on darkness, into darkness. And the darkness thicketed with shapes of terror. And the hunters pursuing, and the hounds pursuing, and the night cold, and the night long, and the river to cross, and blackness ahead. When shall I reach that somewhere? Morning, and keep going, and never turn back. Keep going, run a gate, run a gate, run a gate. Many thousands rise and go. Many thousands crossing over. Some go weeping, some rejoicing, some in coffins, some in carriages, some in silks and some in shackles. Rise and go, fare you well. No more oxen block for me. No more driver's last for me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. Exemplifies the links to which people were willing to go to achieve freedom. The Underground Railroad does show us examples of people who bridge divides across race and religion and gender and class. Even though that was difficult at times, however uneasy, so we could look to that as an example. But it's so easy to look at these stories as these comfort stories, right? Believe the myths. You got to ask why we're so comfortable with the myths. I think one of the reasons the Underground Railroad is so popular because one of the slavery stories we can see white and black heroes, but nobody really wants to deal again with what people were running from. They don't want to deal with slavery. We still have not had a reckoning with slavery, not in our history books, and in our conversations, and not a dialogue about it, and truth-telling about it. I think the Underground Railroad embodies what Nelson Mandela told us when he says, for to be free is to cast off one's chains, but to also live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. I have to remember, you are the bridge, I am the bridge. We have our own crises and our own times we have to face. And I want to end with what I think everybody needs to have, and it is a Sankofa sensibility. Sankofa is a word that originated with the Akan people of West Africa, generally depicted as this bird symbolic of reaching back for an egg on its back. It's translated as, it is not taboo to go back and fetch what is at risk of being left behind. What does that mean? What should history tell us? What should history do for us? It means that we are acknowledging the debt of those who came before us. Looking back to the past to acknowledge the best of the past to bring forward into the present. Using the past to memorialize the dead and connect to the pain and suffering. We don't want to lose empathy. We have to connect. We have to empathize. We have to put ourselves in the shoes of those who went through the suffering. Honoring those who came before us. That is what the Underground Railroad is all about. That to me is what history is all about. Take a moment of silence for all those who lived and died on the Underground Railroad. Thank you. Appreciate it.